It's a great pleasure to be here, and I very much look forward to a short but a good dialogue with everybody. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a lowly economist, but have come to the conclusion that we really need you, philosophy, not only for nice ideas and good discussion, which surely is true, but also to help solve some of the most important global crises that we face. I'm completely drenched because I walked here, but also because we're in the hottest days in the history of Earth. Last week were the two hottest days, presumably in the last 130,000 years on the planet. And that is a reflection of a scientific fact, which is that the CO2 in the atmosphere is warming the planet at an alarming rate. But it's also a reflection of a moral problem, which is that the world's governments have not been able to take effective action on this, despite agreeing to do so 32 years ago. We signed a UN Framework Convention on Climate Change at the Rio Earth Summit, and we're 32 years later, and the emissions continue to rise. It's not only that we haven't decarbonized, but we haven't even stopped the rise of emissions per year. And we are on the verge of runaway climate change, meaning that we could hit many feedback processes in the physical planet that would even dramatically accelerate the warming that's underway. For example, the melting of the permafrost or other changes, the collapse of the rainforest, which seem to be possible right now. It seems to be a real possibility. So it begs the question, why are the governments unable to act? And of course, not only are they unable to act, they are engaged in absolutely contrary processes instead of action for the planetary good. We're on the verge of a major war in the Middle East. Within hours, quite possibly, there's a raging war in Ukraine, which is killing 1,000 to 2,000 Ukrainians each day right now. But nobody talks, nobody negotiates, nobody tries to find a way out of this, even though the underlying reasons for these conflicts are political. They really are not simply out of nowhere or irrational or pure evil. They're political conflicts that therefore mean we need political solutions. If you think about political solutions, you might think about the politics of Aristotle and to actually make politics work. So I've been engaged in this issue of sustainable development for much of my professional life, and know a lot of technical things about CO2 emissions and climate change, and know a lot of technical things about how to decarbonize an energy system, and a lot of technical issues about how to get water and sanitation in a poor community, or how to stop malaria transmission or other things, because as an economist, I learned a lot of technical skills, as Aristotle would have said, the how to do certain things. But even when solutions are staring us in the face and emergencies are staring us in the face, we don't act. And we don't act for any sense of the common good, or what Aristotle might have called eudaimonia, or Plato might have called justice in the Republic. We don't act. We seem to be unable to address these issues. Russia and the United States are at war, but the last time the two leaders talked was
2.5 years ago, even though I have offered every day that they could use my Zoom account to talk to each other. But they choose not to talk because that is somehow the approach. So when you are aware of the technical solutions and that they're not even that hard, but then you see that they aren't applied and that there's actually not even an interest in applying them, you ask lots of questions about the nature of the society and the choices that people are making, and you're led back to you guys. You're led back to Aristotle and to Mencius and to Confucius and to the questions of what are we doing, why do we choose what we choose, what is a good society, what are the political institutions that, or the behaviors that would lead to a good society. So I began my own journey rather late in my professional career back to the philosophical roots. This was not something that I knew much about or captivated me for 25 years of professional practice, I would say. I'll give you one little confession. Maybe I shouldn't, but I'll give you a confession. I don't think I even told you, Demetra or Brian, but I was an entering student at Harvard College 52 years ago, and I was advanced standing, which meant that I came in as a sophomore because of the advanced placement tests. So I had to choose a major right away, and I decided that I would major in politics, what Harvard called the government department. And I went to the government department office and met the head tutor, Judith Schlar, and she said, "Oh, that's wonderful. We're very happy to have you. Your first class will be on political philosophy." And I said, "I don't want to do political philosophy. I want to do econometrics because I'm very interested in applying the mathematical model to government," because I had done a paper on that in high school. She said, no, but you'll start with political philosophy. I said, "I don't have time for that." She said, "Well, the economics department is across the hall." And I became an economist. And I took econometrics my freshman year and became an economist. And about 25 years later, I went back to philosophy because I found that the economics was not giving me, it gave me lots of interesting technical answers. So I learned a lot about technique, but I did not learn a lot about ethics. When I started to study ethics, of course, I started with economic ethics as I was trained within my own field. And the ethics that you learn, the little bit that you learn in economics is all British, first of all. And it is all essentially Adam Smith and what he inherited, and Jeremy Bentham and what he proposed. So utilitarianism and Adam Smith. And it's quite fascinating after now 20 years of reflection how completely weird British philosophy is. So this is my main conclusion. It's very weird. It's got a few ingenious ideas in it, but it's basically weird. And it took over the world because Britain took over the world. So a philosophy that is rather strange, actually, became a dominant way of thinking about politics and economics, not because it beat out Aristotle or Confucius or Buddha or others, but because Britain beat up the world, and that is what got into our textbooks. And what is very interesting for me about the British philosophy is that it is essentially all based on the rediscovery of the supposed desirability of self-interest as the core organizing principle of society. Because almost everything about Confucius or Aristotle is to warn you, be careful about your interests, think twice, reflect deeply about what you are aspiring to. You're probably not pursuing what is going to lead to your well-being. You probably would not treat your friends properly if you don't think carefully, because friendship is itself a kind of excellence, and it needs to be learned. And you won't be a good citizen unless you have a certain mindset that you cultivate and that is cultivated in you. But the British idea is completely different. And to be very simplistic, but I will defend it at some length, really starting with Hobbes and finding roots before Hobbes, maybe nominalist roots in Roger Bacon, or even Augustinian ideas from Christianity, although that's not Hobbes' immediate source. Hobbes proposed that people are just self-interested actors with insatiable desires. And so the whole idea of moderation, the whole idea of phronesis, the whole idea of cultivation of good behaviors, cultivation of benevolence, the whole idea of cultivation of behavior is foreign to this long direction of thinking. You don't cultivate anything in economics, you have a utility function. And the idea of that started in expressed form, most famously with Hobbes, who said that people will kill each other unless they're constrained to do so, and that they will kill each other because they have an insatiable desire for power, greed, fame, or other desires. But don't try to work on those desires, just try to control them somehow. And Hobbes' idea was control them through an all-powerful state. But then came one of the most remarkable essays, I think, ever written, most influential, by Bernard Mandeville in the early 1700s, 1705, called The Fable of the Bees, which is a very, very clever and witty poem, an epic poem of a beehive, which takes over all the beehives of the world because it's got the most entrepreneurial bees imaginable. They fight, they're vicious, they're nasty, they're filled with vice, but all of that energy leads to the greatest beehive of all. And then they're told, but you're not behaving well. And so they start to cultivate virtues, and suddenly everything collapses and they end up being pushed out of their home. And the moral of the story is that vice is the great teacher of virtue, and that one should let the entrepreneurial energy of society loose, because you'll create the most powerful beehive of all. So this Fable of the Bees is really worth reading because it is probably the most influential, witty poem in history. Maybe up there with Dante and with Milton in influence, because it was read by Hume and by Smith in the 18th century in Britain. And the idea, and I'll cut to the chase in a moment, but the idea is that self-interest would guide society to a good outcome. In the case of the beehive, to be the great glory of all the bee kingdom. But for Adam Smith, he came to the idea that self-interest, the pursuit of profit or the pursuit of material well-being, would lead the economy to the highest possible output. So there's not a word in The Wealth of Nations, 1776, about moderation of behavior, though Smith himself was a wonderful person who wrote about the moral sentiments in 1759. But by the time he wrote his economic theory, it was that economic self-interest let loose, constrained by market forces, would lead to wealth, and wealth would be the desirable outcome. So eudaimonia is wealth, and the way to wealth is self-interest in competitive markets. And that's more or less what modern economics teaches. It took me 30 years to appreciate how strange that is from the perspective of 2,000 years of philosophical thought. It's about the opposite of what the Buddha said, which is leave all desire behind. But it's quite different from what Aristotle and Confucius said, which is control yourself. Medinagan, moderation in all things. Is that the right pronunciation? Medinagan. Moderation in all things. And think before you act on desire. There's animalistic desire, and then there is human rationality, and they're different. So you have at least 3 systems in your brain. Not for Aristotle, it wasn't the brain, but it was your animal, your soul. You have 3 distinct systems. You have a vegetative system, which tells you to eat and to reproduce. You have an animal system, which tells you to respond to stimuli. And you have a human system, which tells you to think. And now we actually link those to the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, the nucleus accumbens, and other parts of the brain. We really do have different pieces of our brain. And one says, go after it, and the other says, maybe I shouldn't have that extra piece of cake. And you battle with yourself, and if you are a true Aristotelian, you'll leave the extra piece of cake aside, and you will have your moderation and health. So, my point is that we became in the world through history of the British Empire and the American Empire, and they have roots other than just Hobbes, Locke, Mandeville, Hume, and Smith. There are other, many other philosophical roots, also, I would say, Christian philosophy as well in many ways. But it's a very distinctive philosophy, and it's not really the Western philosophy. It's a branch. It's a branch that became extraordinarily important in the world because the British Empire really was the most powerful country in the world for 150 years. At its peak, the British Empire was about 25% of the world's land area, which is a lot. And Britain ruled the oceans, and it ruled the textbooks. So everybody in economics, if you were formally trained anywhere in the world, would learn this style, that you have your tastes and you should maximize your desires. And that's the way to organize society. So that has political connotations too. And I know I shouldn't go on too long, but just to say that the political connotations were mainly Lockean political connotations from John Locke. John Locke's idea, as we learn it in junior high school in the United States, is government by the consent of the people. But Locke's idea was something a little bit different from the way it's explained. John Locke's idea was protect private property above everything. Because private property is yours, because desire is your personal desire, and when added to Adam Smith, a state which just protects private property is the best kind of politics. And so the United States is designed to protect the billionaires from being taxed, and it's quite effective at doing that. Both political parties are funded by billionaires, and whoever wins in November will not face higher taxes, I can assure you, because that's how the whole Lockean system was designed. So finally, let me bring it to our topic. By around 2015, I was in love with Aristotle because he opened up a completely different approach for me, which is that we need to cultivate well-being. We need to cultivate our excellences so that we can achieve well-being, and that living well is an excellence. In fact, it's a set of virtues. It's not something that just comes naturally. It's not just maximize your utility function. It's something you learn. You learn to be a good person. You learn to be self-controlled. You learn to have friendships. And what's brilliant for me about Aristotle is that the Nicomachean Ethics and the Politics are adjoined two volumes. They're not separate. So politics is exactly built on ethics, built on virtues, which is almost the opposite of what we're taught from Machiavelli and Hobbes, that politics is the opposite of virtue. And we display that every day. So I fell in love with Aristotle, and I said, we need an Aristotelian base to be able to establish the kind of politics and the kind of global relations that could help us to solve these unsolved, increasingly dire problems. And the two most dire ones are we're destroying the environment, and we are absolutely on the verge of nuclear war because our leaders are so stupid and so out of control and so incapable of talking with each other that we are, as the atomic scientists say, 90 seconds to midnight in the doomsday clock that they portray. And that's just about right. And I deal in those circles with these people. And they're really idiots, I have to tell you. Idiots in a moral sense. They have no sense of what they're doing and what the consequences are. I'm sorry to tell you, this is my personal experience. So I met Demetra and others, and love to walk around Spagyra and the Lyceum, but then realized one more piece of this, and that was that we need global solutions, and we need to find a way to have a global basis of this. And so I asked the question, how could we find possibly a global understanding around these virtue ethics ideas? And I thought I would learn a little bit about Chinese philosophy, because if you think I knew little about Western philosophy, I won't even tell you how little I knew about Chinese philosophy. So I bought a very nice audiobook by Brian Van Norden, a wonderful friend and professor and guide to comparative philosophy, to Chinese philosophy. And I listened, and it was fabulous. That was the COVID, first COVID moments, as I was walking around hours to stay away from everybody else and listening to Brian talk about Chinese philosophy. And so I called my dear philosophy friend Owen Flanagan and said, "Do you happen to know this guy?" He said, "Yes, he's a good friend, of course." So I began my education in Chinese philosophy. And to, again, make a long story short, I do believe that there is, well, in every great cultural tradition, civilizational tradition, there are multiple ideas and strands and so forth. So I'm picking out the ones I like. I'm not saying that there is one dimension. My own view, to summarize, is the idea of virtue as an excellence, the idea that we need to learn to be good individuals, good friends, good citizens, good leaders, and that our instincts are not what take us there. I'm more or less with Aristotle on this, that it is our capacity for rationality that can really help us to get there, though that's not all. There is benevolence and there is natural sociality as well. But I believe that this idea of cultivating the better side of humanity, as opposed to what became the Anglo-Saxon idea of manage the power, manage the instincts, manage the desires, whether through markets or through the Leviathan or through private property, that idea is not the right idea. The British idea, if I'm summarizing simply, is let the power rip, but control it through competition or through a strong state or through rule of law. But don't try to reform the person. They're free to do what they want. Whereas this virtue ethics is the idea that we should be spending our lifetimes trying to be better. And as Confucius says, at 15, he was determined to learn, set out the path to learn. And then he recounts at age 30, he reached this. At age 40, he reached this. At age 70, he more or less got it right as a matter of instinct. I'm 70 now, so you're almost 70, so I appreciate that idea. But the virtue ethics idea is learn to be good, learn to doubt one's desires and instincts and impressions, control one's appetites for power, for greed, for glory, and so forth. Emphasize reciprocity or benevolence or justice, whichever term one wants in the philosophical dictionary. And my view is, my hope is that we can find resonance of that across all of the great civilizations of the world. So Buddha has a very different approach and a different language, but it's also the middle way. And it's also about benevolence, and it has many elements that have a common theme. Confucius and Aristotle, I think, speak to each other very well. Of course, if you're a professional philosopher, you spend your life drawing the distinctions between them. I'm a lumper, not a splitter. So I like to say, yeah, they get along great. They have some differences. Aristotle was not interested in ritual, almost at all. He did not see the path of ritual as a way to civilize and make a gentleman or a superior person, as Confucius emphasized repeatedly. It's a different, somewhat different approach, but they really get along well, I believe. So my hope, and I'll stop here, and thank you for your patience. We are not, we do not have a global discourse in the political sphere or in the economic sphere that is adequate to our realities now. Suddenly we became 8 billion people with the massive use of natural resources, with unprecedented inequalities of knowledge, power, force, with the capacity to destroy the planet in the most literal sense, nuclear war or a little bit more drawn out ecologically. All of this is about 200 years old in its reality, because 200 years ago, there were 1 billion people on the planet. There was still some empty space, and there was no sense of a global environmental crisis, and just about everybody was born, by the way. So the problems that I'm discussing are problems that have come at us quickly within the last 2 centuries, mainly because of the dramatic increase in technical knowledge. We have not kept up in a philosophical, in a moral, in an ethical way. We need a global ethics more than ever. This is probably one of the few places where such a global ethics can be discussed and thought about in the global world of philosophers. We need that. We're not getting it at the UN. We're not getting it in the UN Security Council. We're not getting it in the G20. We're not getting it where we really need it yet. And so this idea of trying to harness our ethical wisdom and our great ethical traditions to face our current challenges, I think is not only a nice idea, but I think it's an emergent idea. Thank you very much.